Welcome to Light for the Way. Today is our Q&A day, which means that I, Cody Hughes, sit down with Dave Trepanier. Dave's the leading pastor here at Gospel Life Church in Evans City, Pennsylvania. Today we're going to be hitting two questions. One on Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 through 22. Going to be talking about that, bringing it in with prayer a little bit. And then the other one is going to be talking about what it means to truly imitate Christ, and maybe if you can go too far in that. As always, we love to hear from you guys. We have a couple of avenues of participation. We have a phone number, website, and social media. Phone number is 724-538-8341. Website is gospellifechurch.net. And then you can just check us out at Light for the Way on both Facebook and Twitter. And let's just jump into it, Dave. How are you doing?
Pretty well. Enjoying the warm weather for once, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It took all of May to get there.
I'm sweating now, which I don't like. I'm more.
Wait, you're not happy if it's cold, though, are you?
No, I enjoy the cold.
Oh, you enjoy the cold? Yeah, no, it's been nice. It's been good for my kids. You know, we've been able to be outside. We all got sunburns the other day. Set up a slip and slide, so that was fun.
Very cool.
Yep, that's about as much as I've done. Thanks to the lack of movement.
Butler County's a yellow county now.
It is. Doesn't make things easier for churches, but you know, that's the process we're going through. I think these times, I don't want to speak on these times. I want to move on from it. There's plenty of written out there, and I'm still writing on it. But I think we're going to look back on these times and maybe laugh at ourselves with some of the the lack of perspective in a lot of different ways during this time. So maybe not laugh, but something.
I already laugh at myself. So.
Well, yeah, I laugh at you too. So.
Okay, it's just a one-sided thing. So we can just jump right into the first question. This first question actually comes from a listener, not from us. The question is, what is the meaning of Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 through 22? How can this passage be applied to our lives? How can verses 21 and 22 be applied to our lives with regards to prayer? So before you jump into that, I'll just read Matthew 21, verses 18 through 22. Context, this is Jesus curses the fig tree. That's the little subheading. Verse 18. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" And Jesus answered them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith."
Yeah, that's an interesting passage. I think it's a passage that has caused a lot of angst among believers, maybe as they try to understand what is it that Jesus is talking about and why does he curse the fig tree. I mean, it's funny, you have some commentators who mention that was probably wrong of Jesus to curse a fig tree, or, to send the pigs into the ocean or into the sea with that whole demoniac account. But I would say, first, every passage of Scripture is applicable. The work for us is to get in there and figure out how that's the case. It's not that we have to make the Bible relevant. A lot of times it just takes a lot of work to figure out, why is this passage here? What is Jesus trying to teach? Or what's the author trying to teach, etc., etc. So for the listener, especially the one who asked the question, I would always encourage you, get into the Scriptures, read them in their context. With a passage like this in the Gospels, maybe compare. Does this passage show up in other Gospels? What do they mention? Why don't they mention some of the details? And if you do that, it's very interesting. Right off the bat, with the fig tree example, you are brought into the fact that in Mark chapter 11, splits this into two different accounts. This Matthew takes what Mark says took over the course of 2 days and puts it together, right? And he does that for obviously his reasons and what he's trying to teach. So it's kind of funny, which makes it difficult for some people when you come to verses 18 and 19, where it talks about the cursing of the fig tree, and then you have the prayer side of things with verses 20 through 22. Matthew takes what Jesus teaches in both kind of mushes it together into this one account. So I just encourage you, look at the Scriptures, study the Scriptures. Why is Jesus talking about this? So I think I think there's two lessons that Matthew is trying to teach through Jesus. Of course, Jesus is the main teacher here in this passage. Always put your verse in your context. So let's just kind of go through it. Maybe I'll give a couple explanatory notes, and then we'll dig into the bigger picture here. So in the morning, as he was returning from the city, Jesus was hungry, and he sees a fig tree. Okay, now Matthew makes a point that it was by the wayside, and that's important because it's clear that this fig tree stood out. It was nobody's fig tree, right? Nobody owned it. It wasn't in someone's farm or someone's yard. So he finds it, and what he sees is, here's an indication of some of the meaning, is that there's leaves, but there's no figs. Now, Mark reminds us that this isn't the season for harvest. Okay, so if you do a little bit of research on figs, you find out that when there's leaves, there's usually buds. Doesn't mean that the fig itself actually kind of grows along with the leaves. So you could, if you've ever taken, I'll use the example of my house. We have pears. My son's really excited because we had a lot of blossoms this year. So he's hoping that we're going to get a lot of pears. And our pears don't get huge, but if you can eat a pear since day one. Right? It just doesn't taste that good because It's not quite ripe. And figs are kind of the same way, right? So once the leaves start to show up, figs start to grow. They're not necessarily ready for harvest until they're really ripe, but you can take them off and you can eat them and whatever. So the problem here is it has all appearances that it should have figs, right? If you look at the verse 19, it had leaves. And therefore, naturally, a normal fig tree that had leaves would have figs, right? Actually, farmers of that time would say if there was no figs at the beginning of the budding of the leaf, then there'd be no figs ever on that tree. For that, you'd have to give it a year or two to even expect anything. But Jesus's main point, right, or Matthew's main point that he's pulling out here is this thing should have had fruit, but it doesn't have any fruit. And so Jesus responds in verse 19, may no fruit ever come from you again. In other words, forget it. May you never bear fruit, right? You're fake. You're a phony. You look like you should be this, but you're not. You're this.
Right.
All right, that's verses 18 and 19. Then, verse 20, the disciples saw that it had withered, which Mark tells us actually took the next day for them to see it. They said, how did this happen? How did you do this? Right? So I think what's going on here in verses 18 and 19, Jesus is teaching a lesson. And then the disciples don't even really catch on to that lesson. They're kind of enamored, you could say, at the miracle that's taking place. Jesus is trying to teach them a lesson. We call it an enacted parable, which is this idea that he actually acts out the lesson he's trying to teach them. They see this withered tree and they go, how do you do that?
Yeah.
Right? So they kind of miss what's really going on. And then Jesus then uses their question to teach another lesson. So the question is, what is Jesus trying to teach, right? That's the big debate in this passage. But I think if you put this passage in its context, things start to make sense. So just go back a couple of pages, or actually one page, a couple of verses. And the narrative you have right before this is really, really important. You have in verse 12, I'll just read it. Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna, the son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear these things you're saying? And Jesus said, that they're saying, and Jesus said to them, yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of babes and infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise? And he left them, and leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. That's the passage right before. That should help us to understand a little bit of what's going on. Now you get to this narrative. You have a tree. You have a fig tree, which should be producing figs if it has leaves. It has all the appearances that it ought to have. But it's not it has no fruit. I think Jesus at this point is kind of in a symbolic way making a judgment upon the religiosity of the Jewish people in particular, in this case, right, because of the temple account. He got into the temple. What's the temple? Well, this is the place where you worship the Lord, right? I mean, if there's a place where leaves would be abundant, this would be it, right? It's got all the furnishings. It's got everything that you ought to have. It's a place where you're really to commune with God. I mean, if you look at the Psalms, David constantly is saying, oh, I wish I was in your presence, and I just want to be in your presence. The people of God and Ezra and Nehemiah, they understood the significance of the temple. They needed to get into the temple to worship the Lord. It had everything that it should have to look like it has fruit. Mm-hmm. But as Jesus gets in there, there's zero fruit. And so I think that there's a judgment, not only on, I would say, the Jewish people at this point, for their lack of true religiosity, right? To pretend to be God's people but lack fruit. But you could even say, here's where the application comes in. All who say they are God's people and lack fruit could find their way in that. Mm-hmm. Right? Because a genuine person, as Jesus teaches us in John 15, if you abide in me, you will bear much fruit. A genuine Christian bears fruit. And so it's a pronouncement on anyone who thinks they're part of the people of God but don't bear fruit. That would be the application that I would take from those verses, mm-hmm. from the first lesson I think that Jesus is trying to teach. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's one. Second one, and Jenny, who submitted the question, actually caught on this because she said, how do I apply these verses? And then I think she asked more specifically, right, how do I apply these verses into my prayer life? Mm-hmm. That's where verses 20 and 22 come in, because the disciples are like, I want to do that, mm-hmm. right? And Jesus gives an illustration or uses what I would call hyperbolic language to make his point. And he says in verse 21, truly, I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what's been done to the fig tree, but even if you say this mountain be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. Now, I could be wrong, but I don't know of any account of any Christian throwing a mountain into the sea. And it's perplexed people for years, right? Mm-hmm. Like, wait a minute. Is Jesus teaching if I sit here and pray and really believe, then I can move this building.
Right.
Then I can make the coronavirus disappear.
Right.
You know,
dip in your hands and
some of the televangelists have made claims of such. On a side note, I've been wondering where all the miracle workers are. But anyways, that's for another day. But you notice that statement, even if you say this mountain, I need to point this out. Jesus is a teacher. Jesus is a teacher of a Jewish heritage. The Jewish heritage of teaching would use mountains as an explanation of something great, mm-hmm. right? The issue is not, can I move a mountain?
Right.
It's a spiritual application. It's a metaphorical language to say something great, right? If you have faith, if you believe, right? Whatever you ask in prayer, you'll receive if you have faith. Now, again, there's a lot of assumptions there that Jesus has. You pray according to the will of the Lord. That's Matthew chapter 6. There's these ideas of being fruitful in your life. Is it evidence of true faith? And then you'll pray according to the Spirit. All of that is summed up in there. Mm-hmm. But very simply put, Jesus is saying, you don't believe. You really don't, disciples. You don't have the faith. You don't pray in faith. So the application is not, Lord, help me to move this mountain. It's how much do you believe in your great God to be able to accomplish things that seem impossible? Mm-hmm. That's the big application, even with your prayer. Now, he may not answer it according to that will, but the test is not how you pray. The test is how big do you think your God is?
Right.
That's what he's applying there. So it's kind of a twofold application. Mm-hmm. It's a heart check. Do I got fruit? And then secondly, how big do I think God is? Do I really trust him? Do I really think he can pull the impossible off, humanly speaking? I think it's a challenge in that way.
Mm-hmm. Praying big prayers and actually knowing that God can answer those big prayers.
I think so.
You know?
Yeah, I think so. You're not forcing God to move the mountain, right? That's the question is, how big is your God? Mm-hmm. You know, and I just remember even like in college, we had a no debt policy at the school I went to. Those were mountains, mm-hmm. you know, where someone would have $3,000-$4,000 they got to pay in a week, mm-hmm. and they had nothing, and all they had was God.
Right.
Right. That's how we think. They had everything, right?
Right.
And God would miraculously provide,
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think that was a really good expounding.
yeah, it's an
of
interesting passage. You kind of,
Yeah, I've definitely read that, and you kind of read something like that, and you're like, I'll probably figure out what that means later, and you kind of
just pass it over.
Yeah, you're like,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly if should I take that literally? Like, will physical things actually move? And you're like, I don't think so, but
Yeah.
I think it's more symbolic than that. But
Yeah, we pastors do the same thing. We just go like, oh, that's interesting. I don't have time for that right now.
yeah, it's like,
just move
I'll
on.
figure that out later.
Yeah.
But then I'll just go.
What does John
I'll
MacArthur say about this?
I'll just keep praying.
Yeah.
So switching gears, this one wasn't inputted by wasn't asked by a listener, but something that you brought up, and you actually just finished a dissertation kind of talking about imitating Christ. So a couple questions. I'll just run through them real quick, and then we'll take time and go through them.
Yeah, jump into the idea.
So what does it mean to imitate Christ? That's the main question. And then the couple things that I had following that were, to what extent are we to imitate? Is it possible that the imitation of Christ could be taken to the extreme? How does the Old Testament believers imitate Christ when he wasn't born yet, born into the world? And how do we imitate Christ today? Is there any difference between how they would do it to how we do it now?
Yeah.
So the first thing, to what extent are we to imitate Christ?
Yeah, let me go back, kind of take one more step back and talk about the importance of this topic, right? Especially in Protestant circles. Catholic circles have developed it significantly. Protestant circles have been afraid of it, and mostly because of fear of moralism. The Christian life, you just try to imitate Jesus, and lack of definition, right? Actually, my dissertation dealt with what does that actually mean, and it analyzed how Paul, Peter, John, and the writer of Hebrews developed the imitation of Christ, and maybe the way they did it gives us insight into how we do it. So it's kind of a complicated and boring read. If you ever are bored, I'll give you a copy of the dissertation.
Sure.
But I think I would emphasize right off the bat that imitation is very, very important. It's actually, God made us that way, right? That's how you learn things.
Imitation.
Right? You learn by imitation. And no one, right off the bat when I say that, nobody tries to imitate perfectly. We always laugh at the kid who tries to perfectly imitate dad, and they put on the floppy shoes and the suit and they look funny. And we laugh at that. But we recognize that true imitation is not mimicry. Right? So the extent, can you go crazy with it? Sure. You could start dressing up in a robe and walking around with, I guess you have to look Latin, because every Jesus I've seen looks Latin, but nobody knows what you look like. You look Middle Eastern. So you got to grow long hair and grow a beard. You have followers. We shouldn't be thinking that right off the bat. You asked the question about the Old Testament. They didn't imitate Christ. Interestingly, in the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2, imitation is first mentioned for God. Imitate God, just as God in Christ forgave you. That's 4:32. But he says imitate God.
Right.
Because in the Old Testament, you find out they have this phrase, and I could spend a lot of time on this, so I'm trying to pull it all together. But there's this phrase in the Old Testament called about the way of God. Imitation in the Old Testament was you do things the way God would do them, right? Leviticus 19, you are holy, you shall be holy. Why? Because I'm holy. I've set the pattern for you to be holy. So I am holy, therefore you do so. This is to walk in the way of God. This is to live in the way of God. And then in the New Testament, you find out that Christ perfectly lives that out. And now, through Christ, you learn how to imitate God, if you want to say. Right? There's a great book, if any of you are readers. Jason Hood wrote a book, I think it was in 2013. But it's a book, Imitating God in Christ. E.J. Tinsley wrote a book that's really good, and Jimmy Agan. All those three have really helped me understand the importance of imitation of Christ. So in the Old Testament, they would imitate God, right? Because that's what we're called to do in the New Testament. It was expected, and it was also an example of those who were truly mature, right? So 1 Thessalonians 1, Paul speaks about the Thessalonians who became imitators of Paul and of Christ. And then it says they then became examples for the rest of Macedonia, so that other people would start to imitate them as they imitated Christ. So imitation is an important thing, but everyone's afraid of it, Because what does it mean?
Right.
When I was in high school many moons ago, Janie Tinkelberg, that was her name, but she was a youth pastor out in Michigan, and she started the "What Would Jesus Do" movement. You remember that? The WWJD with the bracelets. She's the one who came up with that idea. That was huge, and everybody, Big Tent Revival came out with this song, "What Would Jesus Do? Walking in My Shoes." That's a good question, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's see. I'm almost out of time. If you look at what Paul does, we'll pick on Paul in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. Let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus, who though he's in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, being obedient even unto death. Okay? If you look at the context of what Paul does there, he points to the example of Christ in the cross. Actually, two things, the incarnation and the cross. Him becoming a man and him taking up his cross and dying on the cross. And he's not emphasizing those actions. So to imitate Jesus doesn't mean become a carpenter. To imitate Jesus doesn't mean that you wear sandals. To imitate Jesus doesn't mean that you eat fish and bread and curse fig trees, Yeah. To imitate Jesus means, if you look at that passage, you start to develop your thought pattern the way that Jesus thought. Right? So in Philippians 2, the emphasis in that whole passage, you actually go back to chapter 1, 19 and following, and you realize that Paul is concerned about two things: how you think and the pattern of action that follows. So when I understand the imitation of Christ, and this is what I argue in my dissertation, the imitation of Christ is found in two things: his mindset. Every time imitation is mentioned in the New Testament, or an example of Jesus is mentioned in the non-gospel writings, okay, not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and the other passages, there's an emphasis on a way you think. Philippians 2, it's humility, right? And so you're called to humility. And then you're not only called to this, what I call a mindset, but also a pattern of behavior. Jesus had a pattern of behavior because he was humble. What was that? Well, it tells us Philippians 2. He was humble, and therefore he considered the interests of others over his own interests, right? That's the pattern of behavior. He put others' priorities above himself. He put other people first. Because if you look at the whole context of Philippians, that's what he's arguing for. Here's your mindset, humility. And what does humility result in? Humility results in giving yourself to other people. Right? And it's interesting, if you look at Philippians, those very things is what Paul highlights before he gets into Christ. And those are the things he highlights that Christ did. So to imitate Christ doesn't mean you go get crucified.
Right.
Yeah, that could happen. There's where is that? There's somewhere in the Eastern Asia area, they crucify themselves as part of their ritual. That has nothing to do with imitation. Imitation has everything to do with following Christ to his cross means I'm humble. And I express my humility by putting other people's interests before my own. One of the main themes of the imitation of Christ in the New Testament is self-sacrifice. I could not think of a more important theme for the church than self-sacrifice right now. Because right now, in our American culture, it is all about fighting for yourself. Right? Unfortunately, this pandemic has proved that American individualism is not only believed, but fully bought by the church. They think to be Christian is to have my rights on everything. There's a political process. I'm not against that. But the way of Christ is to put others' interest above my own. Right? So that you get to Romans 14, where some people don't eat meat and other people do. The ones that know that meat's not an issue are willing to give up their rights for the people who don't eat meat. Right? See, it's developed all through the New Testament. One more example. It entered here and it has disappeared. What was the other one I was going to think of? It was meat offered to idols in Romans. Oh, yeah, for an unbeliever. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Interestingly, another passage that has an imitation of Christ kind of background. But Paul's giving up his rights for the sake of others to share the gospel. He actually puts things out of his way and sacrifices his own opinion on things, his own rights. And he talks about a wife. Actually, in 2 Corinthians 8 through 10, he talks about a wife and money in particular. 1 Corinthians 9, again, he's talking about sacrificing for others, and he's willing to put aside his own rights for the sake of a Jew to reach a Jew and a Gentile to reach a Gentile. I kind of illustrate it this way. When I was in California, right, I came from Massachusetts, lived in Wisconsin. They like burn everything in Wisconsin, the trash. Yeah. And I've used this example before because it's so important. In California, I had 3 different, types of trash bins. One for this, one for that, one for that. I wasn't as huge on recycling. I like taking care of the planet and everything, but it was such an important deal out there for so many people. I realized if I didn't recycle, it was actually an unnecessary stumbling block put in front of the gospel. So I can sacrifice my right to help not get in the way of the gospel. Imagine if Christians started to think like that today. And it's interesting. So I'm just kind of going off right now. You notice that?
I think you've answered all the questions that I had in that whole
whole thing. It's interesting because every time that you see the imitation of Christ in the New Testament, whether it's an example, I'll give you one more, okay? 1 Peter chapter 2 is one of my favorite ones, where it talks about suffering unjustly. And he's telling us you are called to this. Just like Jesus went before you and suffered, he left a pattern that you are to follow. And if you look at that context, there's 2 things that are really brought out. Number 1, the mindset is trusting God. Are you being right now persecuted for the faith? What should you do? You entrust it to God. And it results in a pattern of behavior. What's that? When they revile you, what do? You don't revile back. That's a pattern of behavior. You don't return vengeance upon those who come after you. And so it's really cool. I mean, it's really like nerdy dissertation. I get that. But at its core, it's really, really practical. And I think when you understand the imitation of Christ, you focus on your heart and patterns of behavior. And they get illustrated all completely different. For Jesus, he went to the cross. For me, it might be, I don't know, something else, So
for sure.
It's very valuable and important topic that we need to spend more time developing as Protestants.
Well, maybe instead of your dissertation readers questioning you, they should just watch this Q&A and be like, I think he did the paper. I think he knows what he's talking about. No, but I think you hit on all of my all the questions and even more. I think you went really well into that. Well, that's all we had. Those are the only 2 questions that we had for you guys today. Again, we have a phone number, website, and social media. Phone number is 724-538-8341. Website is gospellifechurch.net. And just check us out at Light for the Way on both Facebook and Twitter. That's all we have for you guys. See you next time.